So today I am also going to give my usual state of Linux talk. So I don't know, is Sean Michael Kerner from eWeek in the audience at all? I don't know if he came this week. He always gives me a hard time. You know, he sort of says, okay, here he comes. Jim's gearing up to give his talk yet again. It's just another rendition of everything is going great in Linux and open source land. In fact, I've become masterful at 1,000 ways to say open source and Linux is awesome. And continuing in that tradition, as the world's greatest cheerleader of open source, I'm going to give you some examples of how, yes, we've topped ourselves yet again in open source, only in the very recent past. We are seeing an exciting time in open source development and in the creation of very, very large-scale, multi-million-dollar open source efforts in a really systematic way. Just in the last half year, a half a dozen multi-million-dollar foundations have formed to invest in collaborative development in open source. These are multi-million-dollar organizations working on multi-hundred-million-dollar code bases affecting billion-dollar markets. What this shows, and this is just a few, right? Some of them are here at the Linux Foundation, like Cloud Foundry, Node.js, Drone Code, OPNFV. Others are in different entities. But these are just a few on the list. What is happening here is people aren't just thinking that open source is a better, faster, cheaper way to create software. They're proving it day in, day out. They're proving it with tremendous value. And I want to show you some of the tremendous value that is being generated in open source today, both on the technology side, but also on the business side. And I'll give you a few examples, and I think I want to start with one last year that happened late last year, which is we have our next Red Hat. I used to get asked for a number of years, like, when are we going to see another publicly traded open source software company? Well, that goal was achieved late last year with a $1 billion IPO from Hortonworks, a company solely based on open source software around big data and Hadoop. That's a huge milestone. Now we have another publicly traded company out there that really is all about open source. And it's not just Hortonworks. Cloudera, just yesterday, for the first time, released their financial results. Right? Now, they're a privately held company, but they released their results for the first time, showing some pretty impressive numbers. $100 million in annual revenue in the last year, 100% year-over-year growth, 67% of that is subscription-based revenue, which, if you're an investor, is the best kind of investment you can ever make with these kind of numbers. Past performance does not indicate future results. But we've seen other milestones in just incredible things going on in open source. Large companies, wholesale industries sort of changing their attitudes about open source. I think the most significant one is, of course, from Microsoft. This is a quote I didn't think I would see anytime soon, but happened in 2014. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella stated, "Microsoft loves Linux." A little bit of a shift from what Microsoft's former CEO used to say about Linux. Nuance, exactly. No, I mean, Microsoft deserves some credit here. I think what they're doing is growing as a company, responding to their customers, responding to the market. Microsoft doesn't just love Linux. They're members of the Apache Software Foundation. They're members of the Open Daylight Foundation. They're participants in the new Node Foundation. They work on a wide variety of open source projects. They do meaningful contribution there. They open source .NET. That's a pretty big change for Microsoft. It has essentially ruined every single joke I ever had. I no longer can take potshots at Microsoft because they're not a member of the Linux Foundation yet, but we will see. But it's not just Microsoft, right? There are other huge successful companies that are basing a lot of their business on open source software. Here's another example, GoPro, right? Sort of one of the poster childs of those cool cameras that you can strap to your 6-year-old daughter's ski helmet and take these very, very cute videos that I am going to spare you from watching today. Thank you. Thank you. But you know, GoPro is a great example of a company that was able to get to market fast, capture an opportunity quickly, because they didn't have to create an entire software stack by themselves. They took Linux, they integrated into their own unique experience and created tremendous value around that. And we're seeing that over and over and over again in the hottest companies, both in the tech sector and in other sectors. Automotive is another good example of this. Tesla, which is widely regarded to have one of the best in-vehicle cockpit experiences when you drive it, right? Just the navigation system, the way that the instrument cluster displays. I know that there are many owners of Teslas in here, some with Linux vanity plates on them. You know, it's not just, this is all based on Linux and open source, this cockpit system. You know, the future automotive cockpit really is based on open source because it's not just Tesla. You know, we have our automotive grade Linux effort, which is companies like Toyota, Jaguar Land Rover, Nissan, and others who are all creating their next generation in-vehicle informatics systems, heads-up display, cluster instrument panels, all based on open source and Linux. It's a tremendous change in that industry as they struggle to keep up with competitions from, you know, in the car, things like a piece of Velcro and an iPad, right? Their competition no longer is other automakers, it's consumer electronics companies, right? That's the expectations people have, and open source is a way to get that value to the market more quickly. IT infrastructure has also fundamentally changed. We're moving towards a cloud-based world. And as that technical shift is happening in the market, open source is really the defining platform for that shift. We're going to hear from folks like Alex Polvi, the CEO of CoreOS today, about containers in the cloud. And when you look at any part of the cloud stack, right? Inevitably gets asked, you know, you guys all look really old up there. When are we going to see some new blood in the Linux kernel community? Well, we went and checked, and of the 4,000 contributors in the last 15 months to the Linux kernel, half of them were first-timers, right? In fact, there is a lot of new blood coming into Linux, coming into every project we host. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And what's interesting here is the companies that are supporting this growth are contributing more and more and more, and in fact competing for those top spots. Intel and Red Hat constantly vie back and forth for that top spot, and Intel is coming out on top again this year in terms of contributors to the Linux kernel. What I also find interesting here is we're making progress in a few other areas. I want you to look at one of the top 15 contributors to Linux here, and you see the FOSS Outreach Program for Women. About a year ago, 24 interns were sponsored through the FOSS Outreach Program for Women. They were paired up with mentors in the kernel community to work on the Linux kernel. And lo and behold, a year later, they are in the top 15. That is tremendous. I want to congratulate those. Please check out this report and see just how dynamic, how fast-moving, how many changes per hour, how many changes per day, how many lines of code per year are happening in the Linux kernel. This report is just, it's epic and daunting to look at. I think it's like 7.9 changes per hour every day, 365 days a year. It is just the fastest moving software project in the history of computing. It is really, really impressive. So what's going on here is that open source, due to the fact that it's touching nearly every sector of technology, every component of technology, from the edges of the network and things like IoT, all the way to the cloud, it really now, open source projects are really becoming the roads and bridges of the internet. Open source software is what is enabling commerce to flow. Open source software is what makes all of this work. And it not only enables, trillions of dollars of economic activity, but those projects themselves, just like bridges, are of tremendous value. And bridges are of value. You probably crossed the Bay Bridge on the way up here. That was built last year or a year and a half ago for $6.5 billion, right? You may have also crossed the I-680 bridge, the northbound span on the way up here. That was built back in 2007 for $1.3 billion, right? Bridges have value. They not only have inherent value in themselves, but in the commerce and the activity that they enable all over this country and so many other countries, right? And open source has really become that defining component of tech. It now creates billions of dollars of value that affects every single one of our lives every single day. It is no longer hyperbole for me to say you use open source software every single day and you don't even know it, and to further say you totally depend upon it. Because I think we have reached what really is a golden age of open source. It is a tremendous place for all of us to be. Or maybe not. So today I actually decided to change my speech. I could probably come up with 1,000 other ways because I'm very creative at saying how great open source is. But one of the things that's also great about open source that I want us to all think about today, in particular this group, right? Real contributors to core technology, companies and representatives of those companies and individuals who've invested a lot in open source and Linux, to think about maybe some problems that open source has. And one of the great things about open source is, we put our laundry out to air in the front yard. We can talk about our problems, and they should be transparent. And so I want to talk about a problem today that's going on in open source, and I'd like to ask your help, all of your help, your company's help, in trying to lick this problem. This problem's not going to be an easy fix. It's going to take us a long time to work on, but I'd like us to start thinking about it more and more right now. If you're not already thinking about it, I'd like you to think about it. And that problem is security. How many people here have read a headline about some major security breach in the last 24 hours, I suppose? I mean, like, $1 billion heist, from banks, CEOs getting fired, countries in hostile situations, the movie The Interview getting canceled over the Christmas holiday season. Security is an important aspect that matters to all of us. And I think it's obvious why. It affects our livelihoods, it affects our privacy. And in 2014, the internet was hit with a bunch of vulnerabilities from open source, right? Heartbleed last April, Shell Shock more recently. There have just been a variety of high-profile attacks coming from open source projects that have resulted in real, true problems. Hundreds of millions of dollars in problems to remediate these vulnerabilities. Actual loss in cases where those vulnerabilities were exploited, at least the ones that we even know about. And this is a tough problem. It's not just a problem for open source, right? This is there's as many, proprietary 0 days. Here are just a few of them that we can talk about. But I don't want to talk about why, it's not just an open source problem. It is a software problem, right? But I don't want to talk about proprietary 0 days because there's not much we can do about them as a community, right? We're just not in a position where we're capable of going and remediating these, right? But we can do something about the open source vulnerabilities. But first, I'd like to ask the question to all of you that I get asked all of the time. Why is this happening? Eric Raymond coined this law Linus's law, right? if Linus's law is true, we all have recited this many, many times before security even became a hot topic, right? Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, right? If this is true, why are these vulnerabilities happening, right? If there's so many eyes, if open source is really working, if this law proves true, why are these exploits passing by? Well, the answer I give, and the thing I'd like you to think about today is because even in open source, there are market failures. It turns out for most of these vulnerabilities, most of them, there are a couple of exceptions, there just weren't enough eyeballs. The eyeballs weren't really looking. And I want to give you, just to make this point, I want to give you some really specific personal examples of where there weren't enough eyeballs, of where there were hardworking people, or a hardworking person in some cases, trying their best, but they just didn't have enough. Didn't have enough resources, didn't have enough time, didn't have enough energy. Let me introduce you to the guy who runs the clocks on the internet. This is Harlan Sten, the maintainer of NTPD, who till recently was making about 25 grand a year. Lives in San Jose, super nice guy, GPS antenna on the side of his house. This is the timekeeper of the internet, right here. It's a little bit disturbing to think until recently the guy who kept the clocks running on the internet was making less than $25,000 a year, right? And Harlan Sten is not the only guy. Werner Cook, the maintainer of GNU PG. ProPublica wrote a story just about a week and a half ago where Werner stated that he was going broke. GNU PG doesn't just secure email communication, but it provides the confirmation that software packages are what they claim to be, an extremely important security role in the internet. And the guy who's maintaining this project is essentially working nearly alone, going broke. He's not the only one. OpenSSL. These are the folks that maintain the project that resulted in what we know as Heartbleed, but also secure most of the internet. Until very recently, it was truly safe to say that in the case of OpenSSL, the internet was secured by two guys named Steve. I'm not kidding. I've talked to these guys, Steve Henson, Steve Marquez, right? The OpenSSL Foundation, and a few others. We're raising less than $2,000 a year at the OpenSSL Foundation to help maintain this. You get the pattern here, right? Not enough eyeballs. There are no eyeballs here. Just two guys named Steve. And I hear they also have a very nice dog, but the dog wasn't doing code review. And it doesn't stop there. Here's another example. Now, this particular person may not be popular in this crowd. This is Theodorat, the creator, author of OpenBSD, sometimes controversial figure, many times controversial figure. But maintaining OpenSSH, one of the most important ways to allow secure communication amongst servers, essentially working on the project part-time, right? Struggling to even pay for the infrastructure that hosts the server that maintains the development of the project itself. Here's Chet Ramey, the maintainer of Bash, responsible for the shell shock bug. We spoke with Chet, and Chet may have, and I don't know, I could use some help here. He may be responsible for one of the oldest bugs on the internet. I think this was like 20 plus years old, shell shock that is. But Chet works on Bash, which is hosted at the Free Software Foundation, and does most of that development work kind of on his own, right? These are just a few examples, right, of what I would characterize as the opposite of what I described in my intro. Linux, this insane, vibrant community, 4,000 people working on it in the last 15 months, 2,000 of which are new to the project, growing all the time. You've got projects like OpenStack that are growing with, thousands and thousands of contributors. You have Cloud Foundry, which has, millions of dollars in resources and hundreds of maintainers. And then you have these folks who are maintaining projects that are critical to the security and integrity of the internet and trying to cobble by and just to make a living and really not keeping up. Think of it this way. Remember that I-680 bridge I described that was built in 2007? Many of you crossed it on the way up here. $1.3 billion cost, built in 2007. Here's another bridge that in 2007 was the most traveled bridge where I grew up in Minnesota. So I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this is the I-35W bridge. For a period of time, I used to go over this bridge, just like thousands and thousands of other folks in Minneapolis, St. Paul, every single day. It's the I-35 corridor, which is a huge freeway that stretches from Mexico all the way up to Canada, right? One of the most traveled arteries in the United States. These projects are like bridges. And in 2007, the same time we were constructing a new bridge, the I-35W bridge collapsed, killing 13 people. Maintaining bridges is important. Making sure we understand bridges that are weak and need help is important. I would argue that Heartbleed was the I-35W bridge of open source. And what I want to talk about today is how we can all help improve this situation. Because this is a hard problem, and you are all smart people who have tremendous resources behind you. And the reason this is a hard problem is because software security is really hard. Why? Software is becoming incredibly complex. I hear in Linux it's changing over 7 times an hour, right? Secure code is hard to write. It's hard to maintain. As you add new functionality, it's very hard to maintain. This is also a hard problem because we don't want to fix what's not broken, right? We want to fix projects that need help, but we don't need to create an open source welfare state. We don't want to create a concept where the market incentives that are working so well in open source break down, further compounding the complexity of solving this problem. So why can we do something about it? I think that's also worth thinking about. This is the important thing that I think brings a little bit of hope here, is only open source can fix these kind of problems collaboratively. Because we all have access to the source code, because we can all work together. Because open source, by its nature, provides us a way to create a collective response to a collective problem. We can work together to make these things better because we have the source code. And that is what we're aiming to do at the Linux Foundation with one of our projects that, I talked a little bit about last year, but we've also been kind of quietly working on, and I want to give you an update on today, which is we think we've created a framework that can help this community attack this problem. It's our Core Infrastructure Initiative. This was created last year in the aftermath of Heartbleed to address this specific problem. To go out and find projects that are important to the security integrity of the internet and to help them get the resources that they need to improve the security of those particular projects, right? And we got 20 of the largest tech companies in the world to donate resources, to donate their time, to lend us their security expertise to work on this problem. We also recruited an advisory board of some of the leading thinkers in cybersecurity. Folks like Robert Secord of Carnegie Mellon. Folks like Bruce Schneier, famous author and security expert. People within the open source community like Alan Cox. People like Eric Sears from the MacArthur Foundation. All working on helping solve this problem. So what is the Core Infrastructure Initiative doing? And how can you help? Well, we're focused on 3 key things in the project, all of which turn out to be a lot harder than I thought they would be. Somehow when we announced this, I thought we'd have this problem licked by the end of the year. It turns out to not at all be the case. Cybersecurity is just an ongoing, difficult challenge that will be around for decades. But we're focused on 3 key things here. First, our focus is on funding those projects that I just described that need help. We've made contributions to help Werner at GNU PG. We are now providing fellowship funding to Harlan at the NTP Foundation so that he can dedicate his time to keeping our time, right? We have 2 fellows working on OpenSSL, the 2 key maintainers of that code base. We provide fellowships so that they can work on that full time. We're funding OpenSSH, we're funding the Open Crypto Audit Project, and we're looking for other projects to fund. And we have a whole bunch of resources that we can provide these projects. Not only funding for current developers to work on this, but maybe finding a new maintainer to work on an abandoned but still used project. Maybe building test and build infrastructure for these projects so they can improve their code. Funding for external audits and other things that can help improve immediately these projects. And I'll show you in a few minutes some results that we're seeing early on in this effort. But finding these projects, as you saw from the slides that I showed earlier, was pretty easy to do. These are obviously important projects to the security and integrity of the internet. And when you talk to Harlan, or you talk to the Steves, or you talk to any of these guys, it's pretty obvious they could use some help, right? The next problem we had was, how do we find the next 100 of these? How do you rank them in order of priority, and what do you do about them, right? And so what we are undertaking right now is a research project. We've been working on this project for a few months to essentially take a census of the infrastructure that runs the internet, in particular from a security perspective, right? What we're really looking for is the next OpenSSL or NTP. And this is not actually as easy as it sounds, because again, what we're trying to do here is help projects that need help, but not ruin the market economics that make open source so effective, right? We don't want to, somehow insert ourselves into, a rising next node JS, right, and screw up that, wonderful market mechanism that makes that work so well. But we definitely want to shore up the OpenSSLs and NTPs of the world. And so we're looking at this from a wide variety of metrics, right? We've taken all of the major, widely distributed server infrastructure in open source that runs most of the internet, and we're looking at every single package. What is their exposure to attack? Measured by when a particular package has had a last critical vulnerability. We're looking at results from static checkers. Was the project written in C or C++, given how easy it is to write vulnerable code? Were there a number of past vulnerabilities? Are there few or no developers? Is there poor bug response within that project? Are there a number of commits over time, getting lower or sort of leveling off, right? We're doing a dependency map on every single one of these different components so that we can see which ones depend on others, right? We're looking at fuzz testing, external auditing. We're looking at the age of the projects. Are they more than 10 years old? We're looking at the ubiquity of these projects. What percentage of the internet actually depends on these particular projects? We're looking at whether or not there's public access to their Git repositories. We're looking at whether or not there's documentation in there, whether there's a working website. How many lines of code are there? The bigger the code base, the bigger the problem might be, right? You get to see how quickly this becomes an actually complex problem to figure out which ones are the most important, which ones need the most help, and then how to actually apply that help, right? Is it fellowships? Is it testing? What is it, right? The good news is that work is going on right now, and we will be publishing the initial findings of that survey soon. And what we are hoping is that people will help us refine those results. So what we're doing is fixing things that we know and working on helping those projects, figuring out what the next set of things to fix are, and then the third area we're working on is around security best practices for all open source projects, whether they're successful open source projects or screwed up open source projects or not, right? But what we're really doing is trying to create documentation that will allow for secure coding practices across all open source projects, best practices around automating testing for security, again, static analysis, doing things like that. Checking to see if open source projects have, again, publicly accessible Git repos, working websites, and so forth. Does a project have a working security email address, right? Are they running a linter on their code? These are all things that we're developing as a set of best practices so that we can basically bring to the open source community a way to create secure code in the first place, right? And you see when you combine these three elements, what you get is something that's a lot more like a personal trainer when it comes to security vulnerabilities than a surgeon, right? Surgeons in the security world find 0 days, they operate on remediating them, and then they move on to the next operation. A personal trainer, which basically is painful and it stinks to work with day in, day out, but they basically keep you healthy so you don't go into the doctor in the first place, right? Think of CII like that. Think of the best practices like that. If you're working as a maintainer in an open source project, if you're influential in a community, we want to work with you to bring these security practices to your projects. And here's how it can help. This is the number of OpenSSL bugs since we started funding it and since Heartbleed, right? And what you can see is a dramatic increase with a very, what I would argue is a modicum of resources here in terms of the number of bugs that they've been actually able to resolve, right? This is a huge increase from where that project used to be. And again, we're not getting rid of OpenSSL anytime soon. There are over 6,000 dependencies in any Linux distribution on OpenSSL. This is not a rip and replace package for the internet. There's not an option here that's very clear. And so improving this project is critical. Now the question you might all ask is, how do we actually know that they're closing the right bugs out, that they're actually rejecting the right ones? Well, at CII, we also have another expression. It's one that Ronald Reagan was very fond of quoting. It's a Russian expression that he used during the arms negotiations with the Soviet Union back in the 80s, which is a Russian phrase called "doverai и proverai," trust but verify, right? And so in addition to this group getting resources to close these bugs out, we are doing a full-scale audit of 500,000 lines of code with a third-party organization. It started just in January, auditing the entire OpenSSL code base for security. So these are the kind of programs that we think will get us ahead of this game. And we think it's important. And I think it's pretty obvious, but I want to repeat it for all of you. The security, privacy, and stability of the internet matters, right? And whether you like it or not, it is open source that really enables all of this stuff, right? I think this is something that we can all agree on. That's important. It's something we should focus on. It's something that's important to us, whether you look at it from a privacy and liberty perspective, whether you look at it from a commerce perspective, or whatever angle you look at it, whether you're in open source or proprietary software, this matters. Cybersecurity, these issues matter. Just last Friday, Tim Cook, the CEO of the world's biggest technology company, arguably a very closed and proprietary software company, I think said this well. And it could apply to Apple just as well as it could apply to, or it applies to Apple just as well as it could apply to us, right? he was talking about cybersecurity and privacy and how people have trusted us with their information, and how we can harness the technology we have at our disposal. And I would argue in the open source community, we can harness our biggest asset, which is our community, to protect the privacy of people's personal information, to protect the security and stability of the internet, which enables most of our ways of lives these days. And so yes, open source is having a golden age, but there's still much more work to do. And we need your help. And so what I want to do is a call to action to all of you to help us out here. Tell us about open source projects that you know of that need help. We're looking. We have resources to provide. We are looking to help, right? The census and best practices guidelines will be up. We want your feedback. And we also want, if your company is not already a member of the core infrastructure, we'd like you to join. And I want to be really clear about what we've done in terms of recruiting these 20 companies. We raised about $6 million over 3 years, $2 million a year. I can tell you right now, it seems like a lot of money. It is not enough. It is not enough money to go out and do all of the things that I've described today and do them well. To help those projects that need help, to find the next ones, to set up a set of best practices, to provide testing infrastructure, all of the things that can really improve this. So we would like to have your company join in as well. We think it's a small price for a huge return in helping internet security, one of the most important priorities we have in open source at the Linux Foundation this year. And I'd like all of you to help. And with that, I want to thank you in advance for your help.